with Joshua and Hyperion today. He's busy. He's got a lot. It's been a real long time, but we were going back to good old Marcuse's One Dimensional Man. Might finish off that chapter that we never finished, chapter 3. What is it, chapter 3? Chapter 3, The Conquest of... Sorry about that, I'm feeling a bit sick. Chapter 3, The Conquest of the Unhappy Consciousness, Repressive Desublimation. The stuff that we covered was basically the basic idea of desublimation, the ideas of how we've kind of gotten a flatter view of the world, so to say, where we don't really have any transcendental ideas, no ideas of anything that can be better than what we have. Our ideal utopias are just, more of the same, and our ideal dystopias are also more of the same. It's not that far different from our modern world. We can easily imagine just tweaking something of our everyday lives, and there you go, you have dystopia or utopia, but both of them are pretty, and they're not that different, really. Didn't we read something like, Hyperion wanted us to read something one time, and we thought we might record it, but after reading somewhere about a third of it, wasn't it, Josh? That we were it was about dystopia and about
Yeah.
Who was the author?
They briefly touched it, and then
yeah, mostly movie analyses.
Talked about unrelated shit.
Wait, who was the author?
No idea, I don't remember. It was from some leftist magazine, but it wasn't anyone I ever heard of. But it was mainly about how even our dystopias and utopias are pretty boring. They're not really exciting for anything. They're just more of the same. So we got that. The last thing I remember him talking about majorly was about the whole point about how transgression is no longer really transgressive. You don't have anybody that really lives in a way that, goes against the current of society.
Well, it's because, of course, capitalism can change and evolve, and it can incorporate that kind of stuff so it becomes more inclusive. And what's considered subversive is just, another part of the culture.
Yeah, that was exactly his point, that being a bohemian no longer gets you, kicked out. It's just oh, well, he's a bohemian. As a matter of fact, it becomes a sellable identity. Being a prostitute no longer puts you outside of the realms of normal society, where you can, you're somebody that can do things that other people can't. Because people tell you things or ask you things that they can't ask anybody else. Not really. You're just kind of commodified like everything else. Being a hippie, same thing. It's still it all gets brought back into the fold of capital somehow. So capital is kind of immune to that sort of transcendental deviancy, one could say. And there was a bit of some conservatism, or, well, that's not conservatism, but it's a bit of praising at least some of the former reactionary elements of society. How at least in aristocratic times there was a transcendental culture that was possible.
Yeah, and it's true. I mean, part of the problem was with these reactionary societies, of course. This transcendental culture existed, but it was only accessible to a few elites. But with capitalism, all the culture is available to everyone, but it's no longer transcendental.
Yeah, let's see. Bottom half of page 67. The neoconservative critics, leftist critics of mass culture, ridicule the protest against Bach as background music in the kitchen, against Plato and Hegel, Shelley and Baudelaire, Marx and Freud in the drugstore. Instead, they insist on recognition of the fact that the classics have left a mausoleum and come to life again, that people are just so much more educated. True, but coming to life as classics, they come to life as other than themselves. They are deprived of their antagonistic force, of the estrangement, which was the very dimension of their truth. The intent and function of these works have thus fundamentally changed. If they once stood in contradiction to the status quo, this contradiction is now flattened out. But such assimilation is historically premature. It establishes cultural equality while preserving domination. Society is eliminating the prerogatives and privileges of feudal aristocratic culture together with its contents. The fact that the transcending truths of the fine arts, the aesthetics of life and thought, were accessible only to the few wealthy and educated was the fault of a repressive society. But this fault is not corrected by paperbacks, general education, long-playing records, and the abolition of formal dress in the theater and concert hall. And as I said back last time, I also miss that the idea of formal dress. You do specific rituals and wear specific kind of clothes for certain things. It's annoying, if it's not your thing, but I like it. I don't know. There seems to be something to that. I think that just makes it a bit more involved, a bit more authentic.
You a traditionalist now?
Somewhat, maybe. The cultural privileges express the injustice of freedom, the contradiction between ideology and reality, the separation of intellectual from material productivity, but they also provided a protected realm in which the tabooed truths could survive in abstract integrity, remote from the society which suppressed them. And now this remoteness has been removed, and with it the transgression and the indictment. The text and the tone are still there, but the distance is conquered, which made them Luft von anderen Planeten. No idea what that means in German.
Air of another planet, I think. The air of other planets. Oh, it's been so long since I've studied German.
Yes, some seems like that. I know Luft is air. Planet 10 seems like, yeah.
Anderen is another or other.
The artistic alienation has become as functional as the architecture of the new theaters and concert halls in which it is performed, and here too the rational and the evil are inseparable. Unquestionably, the new architecture is better, that is, more beautiful and more practical than the monstrosities of the Victorian era. I completely disagree with him. I like Victorian stuff, and I don't know. We've gone so much towards the functional that it's perhaps time to swing back to the other extreme. Just over decorate things and make them overtly complex, just for the hell of it. But it is also more integrated. The cultural center is becoming a fitting part of the shopping center, or municipal center, or government center. Domination has its own aesthetics, and democratic domination has its democratic aesthetics. It is good that almost everyone can now have the fine arts at his fingertips by just turning a knob on his set, or by just stepping into his drugstore. In this diffusion, however, they become cogs in the cultural machine, which remakes their content. Artistic alienation succumbs, together with other modes of negation, to the process of technological rationality. The change reveals its depths and the degree of its irreversibility if it is seen as a result of technical progress. The present stage redefines the possibilities of man and nature in accordance with the new means available for their realization, and in their light, the pre-technological images are losing their power. Their truth value depended to a large degree on an uncomprehended and unconquered dimension of man and nature, on the narrow limits placed on organization and manipulation, on the insoluble core, which resisted integration. In the fully developed industrial society, this insoluble core is progressively whittled down by technological rationality. Obviously, the physical transformation of the world entails the mental transformation with symbols, images, and ideas. Obviously, when cities and highways and national parks replace the villages, valleys, and forests, when motorboats race over the lakes and planes cut through the skies, then these areas lose their character as a qualitatively different reality, as areas of contradiction. Yeah, it's like people who say, like, I'm going to go camping this weekend. And what they mean is, like, they're going to go to a cushy cabin that they rented. It has nice running water.
Has wireless internet, probably has a television. I mean,
Yep. Has electricity and all the things. It's nature without the nature, without the inconveniences of nature. Which is not quite nature, really. And since contradiction is the work of the logos, rational confrontation of that which is not with that which is, it must have a medium of communication. The struggle for this medium, or rather the struggle against its absorption into the predominant one-dimensionality, shows forth in the avant-garde efforts to create an estrangement which would make the artistic truth again communicable. Bertolt Brecht has sketched the theoretical foundations for these efforts. The total character of the established society confronts the playwright with the question of whether it is still possible to represent the contemporary world in the theater. That is, represented in such a manner that the spectator recognizes the truth which the play is to convey. Brecht answers that the contemporary world can be thus represented only if it is represented as subject to change. As a state of negativity which is to be negated. This is doctrine which is to be learned, comprehended, and acted upon, but the theater is and ought to be entertainment, pleasure. However, entertainment and learning are not opposites. Entertainment may be the most effective mode of learning. To teach what the contemporary world really is behind the ideological and material veil, how it can be changed, the theater must break the spectator's identification with the event on the stage. Not empathy and feeling, but distance and reflection are required. The estrangement effect is to produce this dissociation in which the world can be recognized as what it is. The things of everyday life are lifted out of the realm of the self-evident. That which is natural must assume the features of the extraordinary. Only in this manner can the laws of cause and effect reveal themselves. The estrangement effect is not superimposed on literature. It is rather literature's own answer to the threat of total behaviorism, the attempt to rescue the rationality of the negative. In this attempt, the great conservative of literature joins forces with the radical activists. Paul Valéry insists on the inescapable commitment of the poetic language to the negation. The verses of this language ne parlons jamais que des choses absentes, choses absentes.
Ne parlons jamais que de choses absentes.
So it does not speak, but it... I don't know what chose is.
Choses,
So it does not speak, but...
It never speaks, but... Choses absentes.
That means things, right?
Yeah.
Shows. Never speaks.
Of
which,
absent things?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
Well, let's see. Continuing, they speak of that which, though absent, haunts the established universe of discourse and behavior as its most tabooed possibility. Neither heaven nor hell, neither good nor evil, but simply le bonheur.
Happiness. The happiness. Bonheur.
Thus, the poetic language speaks of that which is of this world, which is visible, tangible, audible in man and nature, and of that which is not seen, not touched, not heard. By the way, being somebody who can't speak multiple languages, that's part of the one-dimensional society. Which is pretty standard for Americans.
Yeah.
Creating and moving in a medium which presents the absent, the poetic language is a language of cognition, but a cognition which subverts the positive. In its cognitive function, poetry performs the great task of thought. Le travail qui fait vivre en nous ce qui n'existait pas.
Le travail qui fait vivre en nous ce qui n'existe pas.
The work which makes life and us not
Does not
exist.
exist.
Yeah, the translation is footnote, the effort which makes live in us that which does not exist. Naming the things that are absent is breaking the spell of the things that are. Moreover, it is the ingression of a different order of things into the established one. Le commencement d'un monde, the beginning of a world. For the expression of this other order, which is transcendence within the one world, the poetic language depends on the transcendent elements in ordinary language. However, the total mobilization of all media for the defense of the established reality has coordinated the means of expression to the point where communication of transcending contents becomes technically impossible. The specter that has haunted the artistic consciousness since is it Mayarmé? I don't know, like how the double L.
Mayarmé. Yeah.
The impossibility of speaking a non-reified language of communicating the negative has ceased to be a specter. It has materialized. The truly avant-garde works of literature communicate the break with communication. With Rimbaud and then with Dadaism and Surrealism, literature rejects the very structure of discourse.
Rimbaud.
Alright, Rimbaud.
You said Rimbaud.
Rimbaud.
Very famous French poet.
And then with Dadaism and Surrealism, literature rejects the very structure of discourse which, throughout the history of culture, has linked artistic and ordinary language. The propositional system, which, with a sentence as its unit of meaning, has the medium in which the two dimensions of reality could meet, communicate, and be communicated. The most sublime poetry and the lowest prose shared this medium of expression. Then modern poetry
détrousser les rapports de langue et du langage et ramener le discours à des stations de mots. I hope that's how it's pronounced.
I wouldn't know. Which, translated at the bottom, destroyed the relationship of the language and brought this discourse back to the stage of words. The word refuses the unifying, sensible rule of the sentence. It explodes the pre-established structure of meaning and, becoming an absolute object itself, designates an intolerable, self-defeating universe. A discontinuum, this subversion of the linguistic structure implies a subversion of the experience of nature. And I'll just read the translation, the footnote. Quote, nature becomes a discontinuum of solitary and terrible objects because they have only virtual links. No one chooses for them a privileged meaning or use or service. No one reduces them to mean a mental attitude or an intention. That is to say, in the last analysis, a tenderness. These word objects without link, armed with all the violence of their explosive power, these poetic words exclude men. There is no poetic humanism in modernity. This heady discourse is a discourse full of terror, which means that it relates man not to other men, but to the most inhuman images of nature: heaven, hell, the sacred, childhood, madness, pure matter, etc. The traditional stuff of art, images, harmonies, colors, reappears only as quotes, residues of past meaning in a context of refusal. Thus, the surrealist paintings gather together what functionalism covers with taboos because it betrays reality as reification and the irrational in its rationality. Surrealism recaptures what functionalism denies to man. The distortions demonstrate what the taboo did to the desired. Thus, surrealism rescues the obsolete, an album of the idiosyncrasies where the claim for happiness evaporates, that which the technified world refuses to man. I don't know. Or the work of Bertolt Brecht preserves the promesse de bonheur.
Promesse de bonheur. Promise of happiness.
Contained in romance and kitsch, moonshine in the blue sea, melody and sweet home, loyalty and love, by making it into political ferment. His characters sing of lost paradises and of unforgettable hope.
Siehst du den Mond über solche Geliebte? Jedoch eines Tages und der Tag war blau. Zuerst war es immer Sonntag und ein Schiff mit 8 Segeln. Alter Bilbao-Mond, da wo Nacht Liebe lohnt.
What's the gist of that?
Oof. I can barely translate.
Well, it's a song. It's the lyrics, German lyrics to some song, it seems. And the song is one of cruelty and greed, exploitation, cheating, and lies. The deceived sing of their deception, but they learn or have learned its causes, and it is only in learning the causes and how to cope with them that they regain the truth of their dream. My dog is like giving me the most miserable face in time, just staring at me, like guilting me to take him for a walk. It's too hot right now. I don't know if you can hear him.
No, I mean, how hot is it?
It's hot that I'm
where you
like sweating a bit inside. It's a bit better outside, but like once you get walking, like it's still hot. I'll take him outside later. I'll give him a good walk. Oh, poor little guy. He's like, you haven't taken me for a walk in 2 days. Come on. Alright, continuing. Sorry. The deceived sing of their deception, but they learn or have learned its causes, and it is only in learning the causes or how to cope with them that they regain the truth of their dream. Yeah, I believe it. The efforts to recapture the great refusal in the language of literature suffer the fate of being absorbed by what they refute. As modern classics, the avant-garde and the beatniks share in the function of entertaining without endangering the good conscience of the men of goodwill. This absorption is justified by technical progress. The refusal is refuted by the alleviation of misery in the advanced industrial society. The liquidation of high culture is a byproduct of the conquest of nature and of the progressing conquest of scarcity. So just going a bit over what he said, like the stuff about language. I don't know, maybe it's just because I'm not really into that kind of stuff that I don't know, like I don't really feel it or notice it. Because I mean, the way you use language, yes, is that it changes things, but like once you start doing like weird things, like this like bizarre broken poetry and whatnot, offbeats and whatnot, I just don't get it. There's something like, say, like the way like Kant or Hegel writes, in which like they write in this like super autistic, like really convoluted way sometimes. But you can't. You got to do it that way. Literally, like the train of thought has, in order to be true, or the language to be true to the train of thought, you have to write it out that way. You really can't not. But with what he's saying, I mean, I get the gist of like, if you gotta, if the way that the regular thing goes is, this instrumental rationality of everything's supposed to go, neatly work, and it's supposed to be useful, it's supposed to be for some other end other than itself, it's and all it does is really just give you a sense of more of the same. Having this stuff that's jarring is one way to try to get a message through of something that is truly other. But at the same time, I don't think that's really that successful. I mean, how popular in the end, was Dada, and how, and then nowadays, I mean, like that's kind of like become a kitsch in itself, where people see it and they're not really surprised by it anymore. They actually expect it. It's become instrumentalized. It's become part of the instrumental rationality.
Well, now art too is almost like a competition to see who can be the edgiest, who can be the most groundbreaking. And it gets to the point where nothing is groundbreaking anymore. Like we've seen it all, we've experienced it all. It's just it becomes very mundane.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, I mean, what I find most surprising that you don't encounter very much is precisely having something that's actually well put together. Rather than jarring you, rather than being jarred by its brokenness, like what you're jarred by is kind of like, wow, this is really well put together. It actually gives you a lot to like bring together, both as like as an experiential aesthetic as well as just a conceptual aesthetic. And I don't know, for me that's that's pretty rare. It's always been pretty rare, but it's definitely rarer today in the mass of things. And it's nice when you find it, and you don't always find it in groundbreaking things, but it's there, and just seeing part of that is nice. All right, continuing. Where were we? I shifted pages. Invalidating the cherished images, page 74.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think so.
invalidating the cherished images of transcendence by incorporating them into its omnipresent daily reality. This society testifies to the extent to which insoluble conflicts are becoming manageable, to which tragedy and romance, archetypal dreams and anxieties are being made susceptible to technical solution and dissolution. The psychiatrist takes care of the Don Juans, Romeos, Hamlets, Fausts, as he takes care of Oedipus. He cures them. The rulers of the world are losing their metaphysical features. Their appearance on television, at press conferences, in parliament, and at public hearings is hardly suitable for drama beyond that of the advertisement, while the consequences of their actions surpass the scope of the drama. Yeah, I'd say like there's still a division, but it's a kind of like not a strict division in like the ways like the big people in the world and the small people in the world kind of like portray themselves and behave. There's no, since there is no noble culture anymore, and not at least explicitly. No noble dress anymore. I mean, like one of the biggest lies that the people in power put out there is we're just like you. Hey, we're just a normal person too. Continuing. The prescriptions for inhumanity and injustice are being administered by a rationally organized bureaucracy, which is, however, invisible at its vital center. The soul contains few secrets and longings which cannot be sensibly discussed, analyzed, and polled. Solitude, the very condition which sustained the individual against and beyond his society, has become technically impossible. Logical and linguistic analysis demonstrate that the old metaphysical problems are illusory problems. The quest for the meaning of things can be reformulated as the quest for the meaning of words, and the established universe of discourse and behavior can provide perfectly adequate criteria for the answer. Perhaps that's how things looked back then. He was writing this in the 60s, where there was the golden age was coming, slowing down and coming to an end, but it still was considered quote unquote the golden age for white people. But nowadays, I don't think that's really the case. For example, solitude is a huge problem. Despite how connected we are by all the technical means, people are probably lonelier than ever before.
And that's exactly the problem. I mean, Facebook is not a community. Lefty Pole is not really a community. I mean, we're not dependent on each other through those means. I mean, because I mean, like, I have plenty of friends on Facebook, like, that I use with my real name, of course, but, I mean, um, I would say the vast majority of those people I have never met, and I mean, if they saw me on the street, they probably wouldn't even recognize it's me. So,
Yep. And logical linguistic analysis demonstrate that the old metaphysical problems are illusory problems, shitting on Wittgenstein and his analytics. So yeah, the whole problem is like manifest in multiple ways, and there's the logic of modernity playing out, but in a twisted sense. Like for example, like Hegel's philosophy has a logic of modernity to it. It seeks to be a foundationless foundation, seeks to be a beginning, without relying on anything prior. But nonetheless, it is a very peculiar beginning. It is a modernity. It is a version of modernity, a logical modernity, which actually incorporates everything prior to some extent, to that extent that it's rational. But for example, the analytics then have that project of German idealism again. As if it wasn't done God knows how many times before. It started with Descartes, tried to do it once. Started with Kant, tried to do it again. Started with the German idealists, tried to do it yet again. And then we got the analytics trying to do it yet again, except the analytics was pretty stupid. And so they decided, well, we just won't learn anything about the past, and we'll start with whatever modernity gives us. We'll start with these abstract math and definitions, and we'll do it the modern way. But the modern way is it's in the bad sense. Continuing, it is a rational universe which, by the mere weight and capabilities of its apparatus, blocks all escape. In its relation to the reality of daily life, the high culture of the past was many things: opposition and adornment, outcry and resignation, but it was also the appearance of the realm of freedom, the refusal to behave. Such refusal cannot be blocked without a compensation which seems more satisfying than the refusal. The conquest and unification of opposites, which finds its ideological glory in the transformation of higher into popular culture, takes place on a material ground of increased satisfaction. This is also the ground which allows a sweeping de-sublimation. And for those who haven't listened to prior parts, you probably should, but de-sublimation is the concept of bringing something that is a higher quality, higher order, transcendental, and bringing it down into the regular everyday ground, and therefore erasing its actually transgressive or transcendental character. Basically removing it's like Che, it's Che t-shirts de-sublimate Che, the idea of Che.
or the fact that, like, there was a time where you could buy a keffiyeh at Urban Outfitters for like $30. and it was one of those, like, really fake-looking ones that was probably made in Bangladesh. So it's like, "Oh, you can just buy these resistance symbols, they're just all commodified for white people now."
And like with an example of art, you see classical music labeled as study music a lot of the times on YouTube.
Yeah.
Just something you put on the background while you study, not a proper art.
Yep. Background noise. Artistic alienation is sublimation. It creates the images of conditions which are irreconcilable with the established reality principle, but which as cultural images become tolerable, even edifying and useful. Now this imagery is invalidated. Its incorporation into the kitchen, the office, the shop, its commercial release for business and fun is, in a sense, desublimation, replacing mediated by immediate gratification, but it is desublimation practiced from a position of strength on the part of society which can afford to grant more than before because its interests have become the innermost drives of its citizens, and because the joys which it grants promote social cohesion and contentment. Yeah, I mean, I kind of, I agree with most of that, in which, the whole idea that you go into a stupid coffee shop and, they have like some random Picasso or something else. Like you go to like a stupid like Carl's Jr. and they have like all these photographs from like the locals and whatnot. And it just completely clashes. It's like, it's just there just to be there. Like it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't really give it an atmosphere at all. Yeah,
Like, it's supposed to feel homely or something like
yeah, but
that.
it really doesn't. It's just like a bunch of pictures on the wall. They're like, pick something. It's like like going to a Mexican restaurant and you have like some paintings by or a copy of a painting, printed version of a Pablo Picasso, not Pablo. Who was
Diego
Rivera? Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
That's who.
The one that had Lenin on the
Yeah, no, you never see those, but you see some of his like other paintings sometimes. And
And you see the Frida Kahlo
yeah,
paintings
Frida
as well.
Kahlo ones, paintings
Oh,
of
her image has been
indigenous people.
totally
Oh yeah.
commodified. Yeah.
But of course, he'll never show you Frida Kahlo's painting Peace on Earth so the Marxist science may save the sick and those oppressed by criminal Yankee capitalism.
Yeah. But then again, that's like for great arts and stuff. Like if you go to like a coffee shop and they have like a bunch of like just it's a coffee themed place and they just have it all over the place. I don't really care. I mean, I don't think that's desublimation of any kind. I mean, it's kind of cool, but it's you stop noticing pretty quickly. I suppose another example of desublimation would be like going to like a smoke shop and like seeing like that famous painting like this is not a pipe, and they just have it there like, oh, it was a pipe. We're about smoking. Continuing, the pleasure principle absorbs the reality principle. Sexuality is liberated, or rather liberalized, in socially constructive forms. This notion implies that there are repressive modes of desublimation, compared with which the sublimated drives and objectives contain more deviation, more freedom, and more refusal to heed the social taboos. It appears that such repressive desublimation is indeed operative in the sexual sphere, and here, as in the desublimation of higher culture, it operates as the byproduct of the social controls of technological reality. which extend liberty while intensifying domination. The link between desublimation and technological society can perhaps best be illuminated by discussing the change in the social use of instinctual energy.
Also known as orgons.
I suppose. I mean, you could guess you could call it repressive desublimation. That the idea that just sex in the missionary position is it's just outdated. That's boring sex. It's the big joke is like oh, that's all you do. Well, you must be a boring person. You're missing out. Why aren't you doing all these other weird things? And
Whips
yeah,
and
and then there's
chains.
and so there's like
Yeah.
this kind of sort of semi pressure to like try things out, just for the sake of trying things out. And it's like find, just like this pressure to like, oh, you gotta find what you like, you gotta try all these things. So rather than a natural like exploration of one's sexuality, one is kind of like pressure to go, they just try a whole bunch of weird shit just because I read it in a magazine somewhere, like Vogue or something. In this society, not all the time spent on and with mechanisms is labor time, that is, unpleasurable but necessary toil, and not all the energy saved by the machine is labor power. Mechanization has also saved libido, the energy of the life instincts, that is, has barred it from previous modes of realization. This is the kernel of truth in the romantic contrast between the modern traveler and the wandering poet or artisan, between the assembly line and handicraft, town and city, factory-produced bread and the homemade loaf, the sailboat and the outboard motor, etc. True, this romantic pre-technical world was permeated with misery, toil, and filth, and these in turn were the background of all pleasure and joy. Still, there was a landscape, a medium of libidinal experience which no longer exists. So that seems to do with, the pleasure of like gaining mastery of something, for example. If you work at a fucking donut factory, like you don't get better at making donuts, you just do the same shit every day. But if you're a baker, you do get better over time. You get you start playing around. You start out with like a given recipe, and over time, you start adding your own changes, and it becomes yours. And and like maybe you're one of those few, like you're the one who makes those donuts just the perfect way, that everybody loves it, and nobody else knows what's the secret. That kind of handicraft, artisanship is just not something you can really do in mass production anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So even though it was work, it was work that eventually could become, in itself, an expressive art of sorts.
Yeah. Work sets you free.
With its disappearance, itself a historical prerequisite of progress, a whole dimension of human activity and passivity has been de-eroticized, and this is eroticism in like a really ancient sense. It's not all sex. It's kind of eros in the Greek sense.
Mm-hmm.
The environment from which the individual could obtain pleasure, which he could cathect as gratifying almost as an extended zone of the body, has been rigidly reduced. Consequently, the universe of libidinous cathexis is likewise reduced. The effect is a localization and contradiction of libido, the reduction of erotic to sexual experience and satisfaction. And cathexis is the concentration of mental energy on one particular person, idea, or object. So, concentration. Especially to an unhealthy degree. Oh, it's what we call autism nowadays. So cathexis equals autism. Just remember that. It's funny to reread that. Consequently, the universal libidinous autism is likewise reduced. Indeed. For example, compare lovemaking in a meadow and in an automobile, on a lover's walk outside the town walls and on a Manhattan street. In the former cases, the environment partakes of and invites libidinal cathexis and tends to be eroticized. Libido transcends beyond the immediate erotogenic zones, a process of non-repressive sublimation. In contrast, the mechanized environment seems to block such self-transcendence of libido. Impelled in the striving to extend the field of erotic gratification, libido becomes less polymorphous, less capable of eroticism beyond localized sexuality, and the latter is intensified. I don't know, man. People who have like sex in cars are pretty kinky people. I'm pretty sure they just do it because they're a bunch of what's it called? Exhibitionists. That's what it is.
Thoughts?
That too, yeah. So I don't know. Sex in a car, desublimation. Doesn't strike me that way. I mean, maybe it was like the boring thing back in the day. Back in his time, that was quite a common thing. Nowadays, like it's not the thing that all teens are doing. Though I'm pretty sure plenty of teens do. But I don't know. Yeah, I just don't see the difference. He says in the former cases, meaning like having making love in a meadow, the environment partakes of and invites libidinal cathexis and tends to be eroticized. I don't see how. I mean, is it that meadows are just somehow sexy? No idea.
Well, there might be some kind of connotation there with passion or something like that.
Yeah, maybe it's kind of like a romantic theme, old romantic literature, but
Yeah. Like you're making love in this blossoming meadow.
yeah. I mean, I suppose like it makes for a finer metaphor than like just having sex in a car, but that's kind of like a retroactive thing. I mean, I don't know. I don't think many people who did that were like going there and it's like, oh yes, our love making is like the blooming of the flowers and the mating of the bees. I think your mind is like too busy focusing on other things at those moments. Well, continuing. Thus diminishing erotic and intensifying sexual energy, the technological reality limits the scope of sublimation. It also reduces the need for sublimation. In the mental apparatus, the tension between that which is desired and that which is permitted seems considerably lowered. In the reality principle no longer seems to require a sweeping and painful transformation of instinctual needs. The individual must adapt himself to a world which does not seem to demand the denial of his innermost needs, a world which is not essentially hostile. So okay, I think what you said about that Chaya is what he's like going on about. That like if you have love in the fields, you can think about it as more than just like fucking. You're partaking in an activity of like cosmic proportions of nature and whatnot. You're part of the natural process,
Yeah.
and if you just like screw in a car, well, That's just screwing a car, you're hot and bothered and that's it. The organism is thus being preconditioned for the spontaneous acceptance of what is offered, inasmuch as the greater liberty involves a contraction rather than extension and development of instinctual needs. It works for rather than against the status quo of general repression. One might speak of institutionalized desublimation. The latter appears to be a vital factor in the making of the authoritarian personality of our times. Alright, so far, agreements. It has often been noted that advanced industrial civilization operates with a greater degree of sexual freedom. Quote, operates, unquote, in the sense that the latter becomes a market value and a factor of social mores. Without ceasing to be an instrument of labor, the body is allowed to exhibit its sexual features in the everyday work world and in work relations. This is one of the unique achievements of industrial society, rendered possible by the reduction of dirty and heavy physical labor, by the availability of cheap, attractive clothing, beauty culture, and physical hygiene, by the requirements of the advertising industry, etc., the sexy office and sales girls, the handsome and virile junior executive and floor walker, are highly marketable commodities, and the possession of suitable mistresses, once the prerogative of kings, princes, and lords, facilitates the career of even the less exalted ranks in the business community. Functionalism, going artistic, promotes this trend. Shops and offices open themselves through huge glass windows and expose their personnel. Inside, high counters and non-transparent partitions are coming down. The corrosion of privacy in massive apartment houses and suburban homes breaks the barrier which formerly separated the individual from the public existence and exposes more easily the attractive qualities of other wives and other husbands. This socialization is not contradictory but complementary to the de-erotization of the environment. Sex is integrated into work. Sex is integrated into work and public relations and thus made more susceptible to controlled satisfaction. Technical progress and more comfortable living permit the systematic inclusion of libidinal components into the realm of commodity production and exchange, but no matter how controlled the mobilization of instinctual energy may be, it sometimes amounts to a scientific management of libido. No matter how much it may serve as a prop for the status quo, it is also gratifying to the managed individuals, just as racing the outboard motor, pushing the power lawn mower, and speeding the automobile are fun. This mobilization and administration of libido may account for much of the voluntary compliance, the absence of terror, the pre-established harmony between individual needs and socially required desires, goals, and aspirations, the technological and political conquest of the transcending factors in human existence, so characteristic of advanced industrial civilization, here asserts itself in the instinctual sphere, satisfaction in a way which generates submission and weakens the rationality of protest. The range of socially permissible and desirable satisfaction is greatly enlarged, but through this satisfaction the pleasure principle is reduced. Deprived of the claims which are irreconcilable in the established society, pleasure thus adjusted generates submission. In contrast to the pleasures of adjusted desublimation, sublimation preserves the consciousness of the renunciations which the repressive society inflicts upon the individual, and thereby preserves the need for liberation. To be sure, all sublimation is enforced by the power of society, but the unhappy consciousness of this power already breaks through alienation. To be sure, all sublimation accepts a social barrier to instinctual gratification, but it also transgresses this barrier. So what I'm understanding from that is the fact that when things are sublimated, there is a very clear divide between what is and what you want or what should you think should be. That the limit becomes that limit is clear. What is stopping that from being reality is clear. So the enemy is clear, the problem is clear, etc. Whereas with desublimation, precisely because you have access to a non-transcendental, non-sublimated thing, you don't seek a limit. You don't look for the limit within which you are in. You're happy within that limit. Which that makes sense of why he thinks it's such a problem that we don't have any sublimated desires or ideals anymore. Things that seem unreachable and to which we can see the limit.
Mhm.
The superego, in censoring the unconscious and implanting conscience, also censors the censor, because the developed conscience registers the forbidden evil act not only in the individual but also in his society. Conversely, the loss of conscience due to the satisfactory liberties granted by an unfree society makes for a happy consciousness, which facilitates acceptance of the misdeeds of this society. It is the token of declining autonomy and comprehension. Sublimation demands a high degree of autonomy and comprehension. It is mediation between the conscious and the unconscious, between the primary and secondary processes, between the intellect and instinct, renunciation and rebellion. In its most accomplished modes, such as in the artistic oeuvre, sublimation becomes the cognitive power which defeats suppression while bowing to it. In the light of the cognitive function of this mode of sublimation, the desublimation rampant in advanced industrial society reveals its truly conformist function. This liberation of sexuality and of aggressiveness frees the instinctual drives from much of the unhappiness and discontent that elucidate the repressive power of the established universe of satisfaction. To be sure, there is pervasive unhappiness, and the happy consciousness is shaky enough. A thin surface over fear, frustration, and disgust. This unhappiness lends itself easily to political mobilization. Without room for conscious development, it may become the instinctual reservoir for a new fascist way of life and death. But there are many ways in which the unhappiness beneath the happy consciousness may be turned into a source of strength and cohesion for the social order. The conflicts of the unhappy individual now seem far more amenable to cure than those which made for Freud's discontent in civilization, and they seem more adequately defined in terms of the neurotic personality of our time than in terms of the eternal struggle between Eros and Thanatos. Alright, we're pretty close to finishing this, so I think we should just read to the end. It's like 4 or 5 pages. The way in which controlled desublimation may weaken the instinctual revolt against the established reality principle may be illuminated by the contrast between the representation of sexuality in classical and romantic literature and in our contemporary literature. If one selects from among the works which are, in their very substance and inner form, determined by the erotic commitment, such essentially different examples as Racine's Phèdre, Goethe's Wahlverwandtschaften, Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal, Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. Sexuality consistently appears in a highly sublimated, mediated, reflective form, but in this form it is absolute, uncompromising, unconditional. The dominion of Eros is, from the beginning, also that of Thanatos. Fulfillment is destruction, not in a moral or sociological, but in an ontological sense. It is beyond good and evil, beyond social morality, and thus it remains beyond the reaches of the established reality principle, which this Eros refuses and explodes. I have read none of those, so I don't quite know what the concrete example is. Let me. That Goethe work is Elective Affinities, also translated under the title Kindred by Choice. Plot. The book is situated around the city of Weimar. Goethe's main characters are Eduard and Charlotte, an aristocratic couple, both in their second marriage, enjoying an idyllic but semi-dull life on the grounds of their rural estate. They invite the captain, Eduard's childhood friend, and Ottilie, the beautiful orphaned coming-of-age niece of Charlotte, to live with them. The decision to invite Ottilie and the captain is described as an experiment, and this is exactly what it is. The house and its surrounding gardens are described as a chemical retort in which the human elements are brought together for the reader to observe the resulting reaction. Still no idea what it's about, but you go and find out, reader, if you care.
Sorry, I wasn't there to pronounce those names for you. I was washing my hands.
Yeah, no problem. But I haven't read any of these, so like the works he mentions, so I have no idea what he's concretely referring to as, you know, this sublimated form of Eros.
Well, I've read L'Effneux de Mal. I've read translations, and I've attempted to read the French, the original French, and yeah, it's pretty dark, honestly.
I mean, is it like what is it? The Sorrows of Young Werther, where, you know, he has like, they have like this kind of impossible love, but, you know, they know they can't have.
No. I mean, there's poems that are originally they were censored for being pornographic, but it's pretty dirty stuff.
Hmm. Yeah, since I haven't read them, I don't get his point, really. I mean, I don't know quite what he means. Because, I mean, he says, you know, this it's a sexuality consistently appears in a highly sublimated, mediated, reflective form. It is absolute, uncompromising, unconditional. The dominion of Eros is from the beginning also that of Thanatos. I mean, like, the only thing I can relate to that is, you know, it's like it's the romantic ideal of, you know, this crazy, absolutely devoted love in which, you know, it's impossible to live with it, and it's impossible to live without it. But I'm not quite sure where that relates to what he's going on about. But let's see if the negative example he gives after this is elucidating. In contrast, desublimated sexuality is rampant in O'Neill's Alcoholics and Faulkner's Savages, in the streetcar named Desire, and under the hot tin roof in Lolita, in all the stories of Hollywood and New York orgies, and the adventures of suburban housewives. This is infinitely more realistic, daring, uninhibited. It is part and parcel of the society in which it happens, but nowhere its negation. What happens is surely wild and obscene, virile, tasty, quite immoral, and precisely because of that, perfectly harmless. Well.
I wonder if he'd say the same thing about the 120 Days of Sodom.
No idea, but that movie was boring.
Well, I'm talking about the book.
Yeah, the book's probably a lot more interesting.
I'm not sure if it would be in the desublimated or sublimated category. I'm guessing the
Desublimated, in my
desublimated
opinion, from the
category.
movie, from what I saw in the
Yeah.
movie. I mean, that stuff is just, it's part and parcel for today, I think. Even though like it has, there's like the supposedly like ideological undertones of all the meanings of the acts. It still strikes me as like one could just watch that as like a movie about like some really really fucked up dirty people. So I don't know. I'd have to read. I had to read what he mentioned in order to see what the point is. Freed from the sublimated form, which was the very token of its irreconcilable dreams, a form which is the style, the language in which the story is told, sexuality turns into a vehicle for the bestsellers of oppression. It could not be said of any of the sexy women in contemporary literature that Balzac says of the whore Esther. What Balzac says of the whore Esther. That hers was a tenderness which blossoms only in infinity. This society turns everything it touches into a potential source of progress and of exploitation, of drudgery and satisfaction, of freedom and oppression. Sexuality is no exception. I suppose, yeah. The concept of controlled desublimation would imply the possibility of a simultaneous release of repressed sexuality and aggressiveness, a possibility which seems incompatible with Freud's notion of the fixed quantum of instinctual energy available for distribution between the two primary drives. According to Freud, strengthening of sexuality libido would necessarily involve weakening of aggressiveness and vice versa. However, if the socially permitted and encouraged release of libido would be that of partial and localized sexuality, it would be tantamount to an actual compression of erotic energy, and this desublimation would be compatible with the growth of unsublimated as well as sublimated forms of aggressiveness. The latter is rampant throughout contemporary industrial society. Has it attained a degree of normalization where the individuals are getting used to the risk of their own dissolution and disintegration in the course of normal national preparedness? Or is this acquiescence entirely due to their incompetence to do too much about it? To do much about it. In any case, the risk of avoidable man-made destruction has become normal equipment in the mental as well as material household of the people, so that it can no longer serve to indict or refute the established social system. Moreover, part of the daily household, and may even tie them to the system. Moreover, as part of their daily household, it may even tie them to the system. The economic and political connection between the absolute enemy and the high standard of living and the desired level of employment is transparent enough, but also rational enough to be accepted. Assuming that the destruction instinct, in the last analysis the death instinct, is a large component of the energy which feeds the technical conquest of man and nature, it seems that society's growing capacity to manipulate technical progress also increases its capacity to manipulate and control this instinct, that is, to satisfy it productively. Then social cohesion would be strengthened at the deepest instinctual roots. The supreme risk and even the fact of war would meet not only with helpless acceptance, but also with instinctual approval of the part of the victims. Here, too, we would have controlled desublimation. Institutionalized desublimation thus appears to be an aspect of the conquest of transcendence achieved by the one-dimensional society. Thus, as this society tends to reduce and even absorb opposition, the qualitative difference, in the realm of politics and higher cultures, so it does in the instinctual sphere. The result is the atrophy of the mental organs for grasping the contradictions and the alternatives, and in the one remaining dimension of technological rationality, the happy consciousness comes to prevail. I suppose, since he was talking a lot about sex earlier, yeah, I mean, it's like if it comes up every once in a while, like major, like kind of like big in the news or something. Like the problems are just like people's just like screwed up sense of sexuality nowadays. Not simply of like, oh, they like these weird like just like way too extreme forms of sex, but rather like they don't really engage sex like as one naturally would engage it. As like I was saying earlier about a natural discovery. What pleases you and whatnot. They get their ideas of sex from like pornography, and then they go and like have sex, and they try to do what they see in like in the porn movies and whatnot. And whether they enjoy it or not, it doesn't really matter.
And I mean, porn, I would say, is very much like the whole, when we talk about things like hyper reality, I mean, I would say pornography is very much the embodiment of that. Like, I mean, it's not what sex is like at all. I mean,
Yeah. So continuing. Actually, let me reread that last sentence. The result is the atrophy of the mental organs for grasping the contradictions in the alternatives, and in the one remaining dimension of technological rationality, the happy consciousness comes to prevail. So with like instrumental rationality, there's you're never supposed to see a negative. There's always it's just positive. There's never supposed to be any negativity anywhere. You're never supposed to be unhappy. Whereas, of course, in the Hegelian sense, in the Marxist sense, that's just complete utter nonsense. Of course, there's unhappy experiences to have. Of course, there's plenty of things that are unpleasurable that you got to bear through to get to pleasure. And that's kind of a part and parcel of existence, and just what you would expect, and it makes things interesting. It's kind of like what happens with education, for example, nowadays. This idea that you got to make education fun. It's pretty stupid. You can't make teaching about the Holocaust fun. You
yeah.
can't make teaching you like how to do logic really fun. I mean, it's something you gotta take seriously, honestly, and like do it. You don't do logic with like stupid little clown faces.
And as soon as you degrade education to, you're trying to make education fun. I mean, like you said, the students take it as a joke, and they don't really see the practical application of it. They don't understand the importance of it. Like, why do I have to learn hardcore calculus and whatnot if it's just a game? If it's just a joke? If the teacher's just my friend? I don't know.
Yeah. It reflects the belief that the real is rational, and that the established system, in spite of everything, delivers the goods. The people are led to find in the productive apparatus the effective agent of thought and action to which their personal thought and action can and must be surrendered. And in this transfer, the apparatus also assumes the role of a moral agent. Conscience is absolved by ratification, by the general necessity of things. So that the real is rational is a jab at Hegel. It's a typical Marxist jab. Something that has there's a wide misconception, and Hegel himself is somewhat to blame for the misconception because he just wrote it really obtusely. And that is, for Hegel, the real is rational is actually the translation is the real is actual, and actuality has something to do with efficacy. And efficacy has to do with being able to actually do things. So when you say the real is rational, you're talking about literally what Marx calls praxis. Real praxis. What is actually really effective in the world right now.
Mm-hmm.
But when he says the people are led to find in the productive apparatus the effective agent of thought and action to which their personal thought and action can and must be rendered, very true. Once you institutionalize anything, and people say like, oh, this is the institution, which like it's like the Ministry of Culture, the Ministry of Reason, Ministry of Science, whatnot, and then people just kind of go and like bow down to it. And it's like, this person from the Ministry of Science says this, therefore it must be true. I'm not gonna bother thinking about it. I'm not gonna bother like being critical. I'll just accept it and take it. And sure, you can't go around being critical about everything, but also you just can't just seriously take the most important things in the world and just go like, well, this guy at the institution said so. And therefore, I'm right, you're wrong, case closed. And when he says, and in this transfer, the apparatus also assumes the role of a moral agent, this is what people say, like, especially business people say about the law, in which they're like, what I did technically is immoral, but it's lawful, therefore. Therefore, in the actual morality, which is the law, as they take it, they didn't do anything immoral at all. So long as it's legal, it's good game. Conscience is absolved by reification, by the general necessity of things, and indeed that's how they justify it to themselves. They don't feel bad because, hey, I didn't do anything wrong. I was playing by the rules. The trillionaire tyrant can't, feel bad. They're like, I'm not a bad, evil person. I did everything by the rules. I have all this money and everybody else is poor. That's just the way the world goes. God just liked me. In this general necessity, guilt has no place. One man can give the signal that liquidates hundreds and thousands of people, then declares himself free from all pangs of conscience and live happily ever after. The anti-fascist powers who beat fascism on the battlefield reap the benefits of the Nazi scientists, generals, and engineers. They have the historical advantage of the late comer. What begins as the horror of the concentration camps turns into the practice of training people for abnormal conditions, a subterranean human existence, and a daily intake of radioactive nourishment. A Christian minister declares that it does not contradict Christian principles to prevent with all available means your neighbor from entering your bomb shelter. Another Christian minister contradicts his colleague and says it does. Who is right? Again, the neutrality of technological rationality shows forth over and above politics. And again, it shows forth as spurious, for in both cases it serves the politics of domination. The world of the concentration camps was not an exceptionally monstrous society. What we saw there was the image and, in a sense, the quintessence of the infernal society into which we are plunged every day. It seems that even the most hideous transgressions can be repressed in such a manner that, for all practical purposes, they have ceased to be a danger for society. Or, if their eruption leads to functional disturbances in the individual, as in the case of one Hiroshima pilot, it does not disturb the functioning of society. A mental hospital manages the disturbance. Am I reading this right in thinking that his point there was sort of to talk about that the sublimation goes both ways? Not only are good ideal things desublimated and kind of transformed as something banal and everyday, but even evil is desublimated as well, such that we can't imagine. We don't accept that there are particularly heinous specific things in the world. That are beyond the normal.
I mean, that's what I'm getting of it too, so.
Yeah.
The banality of evil, that kind of thing.
Yeah. The happy consciousness has no limits. It arranges games with depth and disfiguration in which fun, teamwork, and strategic importance mix in rewarding social harmony. The RAND Corporation, which unites scholarship, research, the military, the climate, and the good life, reports such games in a style of absolving cuteness in its Random News, Volume 9, Number 1, under the heading Better Safe Than Sorry. The rockets are rattling, the H-bomb is waiting, and the space flights are flying, and the problem is how to guard the nation and the free world. In all this, the military planners are worried for the cost of taking chances, of experimenting and making a mistake, may be fearfully high. But here Rand comes in. Rand believes, and, quote, devices like Rand's safe come into the picture, end quote. The picture into which they come is unclassified. It is a picture in which, quote, the world becomes a map, missiles merely symbols. Long live the soothing power of symbolism. And wars just plans and calculations written down on paper. In this picture, Rand transfigured the world into an interesting technological game, and one can relax. The, quote, military planners gain valuable synthetic experience without risk, unquote. Playing the game, I think this is from the Rand thing. Quote, to understand the game, one should participate, for understanding is in the experience. Because safe, in all caps, players have come from almost every department, and Rand, as well as the Air Force, we might find a physicist, an engineer, and an economist on the blue team. The red team will represent a similar cross-section. The first day is taken up by a joint briefing on what the game is all about and study of the rules. When the teams are finally seated around the maps in their respective rooms, the game begins. Each team receives its policy statement from the game director. These statements, usually prepared by the member of the control group, give an estimate of the world situation at the time of playing, some information on the policy of the opposing team, the objectives to be met on the team by the team, and the team's budget. The policies are changed for each game to explore a wide range of strategic possibilities. In our hypothetical game, Blue's objective is to maintain a deterrent capability throughout the game. That is, maintain a force that is capable of striking back at Red, so Red will be unwilling to risk an attack. Blue also receives some information on the Red policy. Red's policy is to achieve force superiority over Blue. The budgets of Blue and Red compared with the actual defense budgets. End quote. It is comforting to hear that the game has been played since 1961 at Rand, quote, down in our labyrinthine basement somewhere under the snack bar, and that menus on the walls of the red and blue rooms list available weapons and hardware that the teams buy, about 70 items in all, end quote. There is a game director who interprets game rules, for although the, quote, the rule book, complete with diagrams and illustrations, is 66 pages, unquote, problems inevitably arise during the play. The game director also has another important function. Quote, without previously notifying the players, he introduces war to get a measure of the effectiveness of the military forces in being. End quote. But then the caption announces, coffee, cake, and ideas. Relax! The game continues through the remaining periods to 1972 when it ends. Then the blue and red teams bury the missiles and sit down together for coffee and cake at the post-mortem session. But don't relax too much. There is one real-world situation that can't be transposed effectively to safe, and that is negotiation. We are grateful for it. The one hope that is left in the real-world situation is beyond the reaches of Rand. Obviously, in the realm of the happy consciousness, guilt feeling has no place, and the calculus takes care of conscience. When the whole is at stake, there is no crime except that of rejecting the whole or not defending it. Crime and guilt feeling become a private affair. Freud, revealing in the psyche of the individual the crimes of mankind, and in the individual case the history of the whole, this fatal link is successfully suppressed. Those who identify themselves with the whole, who are installed as the leaders and defenders of the whole, can make mistakes, but they cannot do wrong. They are not guilty. They may become guilty again when this identification no longer holds, when they are gone. And that is the end of this chapter. And indeed, I think, that last thing he said is pretty true. You notice it about presidents. At least as far as, Americans take it for their presidents. Their presidents are never evil and never do wrong and are never genocidal, like killers or monsters or any of their kind. They can drone God knows how many people for how many decades. But, it was just the president, it was just a war, it wasn't his personal choice, it was going to happen anyways, whoever it was. So it's not his fault, it's, it's either the office, it's just the office, and even then the office is untainted because it's just a matter of, temporal lapses in national judgment and whatnot, and so nobody ever is really held responsible. Plenty of people got murdered, plenty of people got assassinated, plenty of people got bombed, and just as collateral under Obama. But nobody holds Obama personally responsible for any of that, even though he's the one who signs the orders.
Mm-hmm.
And and then it's not just a thing that that the liberals do. No, leftists do as well. People who defend the USSR, who say Stalin did nothing wrong, that kind of thing. They also have that exact same mentality. Well, it was necessity to the times. Unethical situations call for unethical acts. Therefore, we can't really hold them morally responsible or ethically responsible or any of this kind. It was just the state of things.
Well, they also too, they treat their team as if their team is infallible. As if their guys are incapable of making any mistakes, or, you shouldn't criticize our guys because blah, 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 blah. And
yeah. So, right, that's the end of that chapter. And we finished something that we started, at least as far as book-wise, a chapter. For those of you who listen, hope you enjoyed it. There was not much to be said, but then again, I think Marcuse is rather clear. It's not like Hegel where you really have to explain every single sentence. So otherwise, all right, enjoy your time. Goodbye.